We need younger employees, more adaptable, less rigid. My name is Diane. I'm 55 years old, and I've spent the last 19 years building the foundation of what is now Core Logic Systems right here in Dayton, Ohio. When those words came out of my boss's mouth, younger, more adaptable, I could feel them settle in the room like smoke from a burned out server. Gavin Norris, freshly promoted and dressed like a finance magazine ad, sat across from me in his sleek, glass-walled office. His fingers danced over his MacBook like he was writing code, which of course he wasn't. He didn't even know what back-end logic was. I had walked into that meeting expecting just another quarterly review. Routine, predictable. My 76th. I'd prepared graphs, reports, key performance updates, but instead I was greeted with the term workforce optimization. You're great, Diane, truly. But streamlining our talent density is essential for long-term growth, Gavin said, tightening his overpriced tie. He delivered the words like he was reading from a management book, cold, calculated, as if I hadn't spent nearly 2 decades keeping this company's infrastructure from collapsing in on itself. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice. I nodded. Understood, I said, and left. But as I walked back to my cubicle, a quiet unease settled in my chest. A kind of hollowness, because the truth is, I was the one who made things work. When our servers flooded back in 2018, it was me who waded through ankle-deep water to rescue the backup drives. When our biggest client threatened to cancel over a failed integration, I worked 3 straight nights rebuilding the system from scratch, on zero sleep and vending machine coffee. Over the years, I wrote scripts that automated renewals, built bridges between incompatible platforms, and documented processes in ways that only I understood. Not out of selfishness, but because no one else had bothered. The company never invested in documentation. I did it myself, quietly, efficiently, and now I was being optimized out of existence. Trevor from the help desk watched me pack up my things. He was only 26, still bright-eyed, fresh out of college. I had promised to show him how the automation scripts worked, how the vendor pipelines were secured. I had told him we'd go over it once things calmed down, but now there was no time. He looked at me, voice low. Is this really happening? I nodded. Apparently. What Trevor didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Gavin had just fired the only person who actually understood how their entire infrastructure functioned. The scripts, the credentials, the vendor logic, the emergency fallback protocols, none of it was in any handbook. It lived in my head, and in encrypted files protected by layers of access that only I could authorize. 3 weeks passed. And then everything began to collapse. I didn't sleep much that night. The silence of my apartment felt heavier than usual, each tick of the clock amplifying the uncertainty that now filled my life. But oddly, I wasn't afraid. For the first time in years, I wasn't tethered to late-night alerts or frantic emails. The weight I had carried in silence for nearly 2 decades had finally lifted, and I was beginning to see it clearly. The next morning, I opened my laptop and began updating my resume. I didn't embellish or exaggerate. I simply laid out my career as it had been. Every system I'd built, every crisis I had solved, every integration I had led. I submitted applications not out of desperation, but with a strange kind of quiet pride. A few days later, I received a message from a company I had long admired, Vector Core Systems. They were known for their innovative approach to systems architecture and their genuine respect for technical talent. During the interview, I spoke openly about my past experiences, the victories and the missteps, the knowledge I had accumulated and the mistakes I had learned from. They didn't ask me to prove my value with buzzwords or shiny presentations. They listened, really listened. And then they asked me what I would do if given a blank slate, no constraints, no outdated legacy systems, just an opportunity to build something from the ground up. That question lit a fire in me I thought had gone out long ago. Within a week, they offered me a position, not just a job, but a leadership role where my experience was seen not as a relic, but a cornerstone. I accepted immediately. On my first day at Vector, the atmosphere was electric. Young minds buzzing with ideas, seasoned engineers collaborating with respect and curiosity. And in the middle of it, me, the woman once deemed too rigid, now tasked with designing the future. Meanwhile, back at Tri-C, the cracks had widened. I didn't have to hear it from them. The local tech community was small, and whispers traveled fast. Clients were beginning to complain. The automation systems I had built, the very infrastructure Gavin thought he could replace, were now unraveling. They brought in outside consultants, temporary hires, quick fixes, but none of them could truly understand what had taken me 19 years to perfect. And then the call came. By the second week, the signs of trouble were no longer whispers. They were alarms. My phone buzzed with messages from former colleagues, each more frantic than the last. Systems were going down, backups weren't triggering, and the junior staff were overwhelmed. It was Trevor who finally said what nobody else dared to voice. We're losing clients. Fast. I had expected this, but hearing it spoken aloud brought a strange kind of melancholy. Not satisfaction, not revenge. Just the heavy confirmation that all those late nights, emergency protocols, and redundant systems hadn't been paranoia. They had been necessary, and they had been invisible until now. That Thursday evening, as I was sipping tea on my porch, my phone rang again. It was Denise, the client services manager. "We're hemorrhaging contracts," she said, voice tight. "Gavin's pretending everything is under control, but it's chaos. The integration team is working 20-hour days trying to reverse engineer what you built." I didn't gloat. I just listened. She paused before asking, "Would you consider coming back as a consultant?" The offer hung in the air. I could almost hear Gavin swallowing his pride behind her voice. "Let me think about it," I said, ending the call. The next morning, I had an email waiting from Vector Core Systems. They'd seen my resume, asked around, and wanted to talk. That afternoon, I walked into their offices, a sleek, modern space filled with professionals who actually looked like they liked their jobs. My interview was with Patricia Wells, their director of operations. She didn't ask me to prove my value, she already knew. "Doug, we don't just need someone to fix problems. We need someone to help us build better systems from the ground up," she said. "We've heard what happened at Tri-C, and frankly, we see opportunity." She offered me a position on the spot. Better pay. Better benefits. Full creative control. I didn't hesitate. 2 weeks later, I was fully integrated at Vector. It felt like stepping out of a storm and into clear air. They respected experience here. They documented things properly. They didn't treat seasoned employees like burdens. They treated them like anchors. Meanwhile, Tri-C was still unraveling. One of their biggest clients, Meridian Data Partners, had issued an ultimatum. Fix the system in 72 hours or lose the contract. I knew the scripts they were struggling with. I had written them. And I also knew that without the decryption keys and sequence files, they were wasting their time. Trevor called again. They're blaming you. Gavin is telling people you sabotaged everything. I sighed. That's not surprising. Desperate people find scapegoats. Is it true what you said about the systems being unrecoverable without the right credentials? Not unrecoverable, I said carefully. Just not recoverable by them. He was quiet. They don't even know where half the data is stored. That didn't surprise me either. So many of the redundancies I'd built had been designed to be discreet. Not hidden, but overlooked if you didn't know where to look. A week later, Gavin himself called me. Douglas, he began stiffly, there may have been a miscommunication at your departure. I nearly laughed. You mean when you replaced institutional knowledge with consultants who read from slides? He ignored the jab. We're hoping you might be willing to return. Temporary, of course. A bridge while we stabilize things. I looked around my new office, sunlight streaming in, a team I respected collaborating around me, Patricia waving as she passed my door. I'm happy where I am, I said simply. But good luck with the stabilization. There was a pause. Then he said, You should know if these issues are proven to be deliberate sabotage. Gavin, I cut in. If you're calling to threaten me, let's not waste each other's time. He hung up without another word. But that was the moment I knew he finally understood what he'd done. You don't gut a system and expect it to keep running. You don't fire the backbone and hope the limbs will still move. 3 weeks after my termination, everything I had quietly built began to fall apart. And the man who thought experience was expendable learned just how costly ignorance can be. Weeks passed, but the fallout from my departure only seemed to intensify. What began as a ripple of technical glitches had become a full-blown operational crisis. Clients were furious. Systems were breaking down in places no one at Tri-C even knew existed. I received messages, sometimes desperate, sometimes accusatory, but I remained silent. I had moved on, and there was peace in that. At Vector, I wasn't just another cog in the machine. I was treated like someone who mattered. Patricia, my new manager, introduced me to the team as the architect of real solutions. She didn't reduce my contributions to salary numbers on a spreadsheet. She saw experience as leverage, not liability. One Friday morning, I walked past the team huddled in the war room, deep in system architecture discussions. There was purpose in their eyes. I realized how different everything felt. No more late-night calls asking me to fix someone else's oversight. No more managers with polished shoes and empty promises. We were building something solid here. No patches, no shortcuts, just quality work with the kind of rigor I used to believe was gone from the industry. Then 3 months after I left Tri-C, I got the call. It was Gavin. His voice was thinner now, frayed at the edges. Douglas, he said, skipping greetings, we need help. Of course they did. Tri-C had lost 2 major clients that week. Emergency migration plans were falling apart. And worse, Gavin's consultants had caused more damage trying to optimize my original scripts than anyone had anticipated. He asked if I would come in as a contractor, temporary help just until things were stable. I didn't laugh. I didn't scold. I simply said, I'm happy where I am, and frankly, I no longer trust the stability of your systems. Gavin paused. There's compensation and authority. We're open to negotiation. I considered it briefly. Then I replied, "You once said I was part of the past, but I've built a future that works." I hung up. That weekend, I drove past the Tri-C office. The parking lot was half empty. The building, once humming with life, felt like a forgotten shell. I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Gavin had tried to erase the foundation I built, but in doing so, he'd proved just how necessary it really was. Competence, I thought, always finds its proper value. I had finally found mine. 3 weeks passed, and while I was adjusting to a slower pace at home, things at TriSync were unraveling. My mornings started with coffee and job boards, but by the third week I began receiving calls. The first was from Trevor, the young tech I had mentored. "Jasmine, I'm sorry to bother you, but we have a serious issue," he said, panic lacing his voice. He explained that the automated backup systems I had built were failing. The new team, under Gavin's orders, had tried to clean up my code. They modified essential scripts without understanding the dependencies. Now processes were failing, clients were calling, and the systems weren't recovering. I asked a few questions, and with each answer it became clear. They didn't just break the automation, they compromised the integrity of the entire infrastructure. I had built fail-safes, redundancies, encrypted pathways that protected the company in case of system crashes. But those protections were only as good as the people managing them. "Can you help us recover it?" Trevor asked, desperation evident. "I wish I could," I replied honestly, "but I no longer have access to the systems or the credentials." He was silent for a moment. "Gavin thinks you sabotaged the scripts." The accusation wasn't surprising. I felt a strange mix of calm and sorrow. "Tell Gavin I never sabotaged anything, but he fired the only person who understood how your systems actually worked." That same week, I received a call from Vector Core Systems, a company I had always admired from a distance. They offered me a senior integration role with better pay and respect. I accepted. The irony was unmistakable. Gavin had pushed me out for being old-fashioned, inflexible. Yet another company saw my depth of experience as invaluable. Meanwhile, TriSync's problems escalated. Clients lost trust. Contracts were terminated. And still, Gavin refused to admit the root cause. A blind obsession with optimization had severed the company from its foundation. He had tried to streamline the structure by removing what he thought were inefficiencies. But what he removed was stability, legacy knowledge, and adaptability born from years of hands-on experience. Systems weren't just about code. They were about the people who built them, maintained them, improved them. He didn't understand that. And now, everything was falling apart. 3 weeks passed in eerie quiet. I had started my new role at Vector Core Systems and was slowly rebuilding my sense of purpose. My mornings were no longer haunted by the anxiety of being undervalued. But then the first call came. "Douglas, I'm sorry to bother you." Trevor's voice trembled. He explained that the backup automation system had failed, no one could recover it manually, and Gavin's new consultants had optimized my scripts into complete dysfunction. I asked calmly, "Did they touch the encrypted vendor configuration files?" "Yes." "They tried cleaning up the redundant code, but now nothing works." They had no idea what they'd done. Years of my error handling mechanisms, layered fail-safes, and customized authentication were erased in one sweep. Trevor pleaded for help, but I reminded him, No one had asked for a knowledge transfer. Those systems needed credentials, code familiarity, and insight no documentation could replace. I told him gently, I didn't sabotage anything. I just built things to work with proper oversight. Later, Gavin called himself carefully composed but clearly desperate. We're having a few integration issues, he said. You mean the whole system is crashing? Nothing major, he lied. He offered me a temporary consulting role. I told him I had just accepted a full-time position elsewhere. That word, elsewhere, echoed with finality. He tried again, vaguely warning me about legal consequences for sabotage. I reminded him no knowledge transfer had ever happened because I had been shown the door without a chance to prepare anyone. There was no sabotage. There was negligence. And it was entirely theirs. Months passed. At VectorCore, I found not just respect, but impact. My team grew quickly. We onboarded several former Tri-C clients, building more reliable, scalable systems from the ground up. Trevor joined us as a junior engineer. He thrived. Meanwhile, Tri-C crumbled. The cracks Gavin had ignored became open wounds. Clients left. Consultants failed. Panic spread. Then came the final call. Douglas, Meridian Analytics has acquired Tri-C, Gavin said flatly. The company had bought their service provider rather than continue battling failures. It was a quiet surrender. They want you to return, he added, senior director, full authority. I looked around my VectorCore office, clean, bright, professional. I declined politely. Some decisions can't be undone, I said. 6 months later, Patricia, my new manager, walked into my office with a bottle of champagne. Congratulations, she said. You've been promoted to Chief Integration Officer. We had absorbed 12 former Tri-C clients. Our satisfaction scores were at an all-time high. Trevor had become a star developer. The systems I built now supported thousands. But this time, with proper documentation, mentorship, and appreciation. One day, I drove past my old office. Half the parking lot was empty. The building still stood, but the spirit was gone. I smiled quietly. Sometimes, the best revenge is simply building something better, somewhere else.